Before we dive into our program, we are going to watch a very short video. And after the video, we will go into introductions and begin today's conversation with Dina Gilio-Whitaker. Enjoy the program.
Hi, my name is Kasha Samel, and I'm the American Indian Resource Center librarian for LA County Library. Today, Los Angeles County is home to the largest urban American Indian population in the US, and the American Indian Resource Center, or the ARC, is here to provide a place to learn, gather information, and connect with these communities. The ARC collection is the largest public library collection of its kind in the US, with books, journals, newspapers, microfilm, audio cassettes, CDs, DVDs, 35mm film, and more, with information about local tribes, California history, arts, languages, government relations, and race and identity. We are one of the few public places that have Indian census rolls from 1885 to 1940 on microfilm. But along with the collections, we create opportunities to bring Native and non-Native people together around topics that our customers are interested in and that impact the American Indian community today. This center is for everyone. It is on American Indian and Alaska Native communities and topics about them. Anyone who has interests about their communities can come and use our center. This is your center.
My name is Christina McTighe, and I am a programming librarian inside of our marketing department here at LA County Library. And tonight, I have the honor of introducing you to our speakers. Leading tonight's conversation, we have two special guests from the library. First, we have Isabel Briggs. Isabel is the Arts and Culture Program Coordinator for LA County Library. She develops programming and manages partnerships with arts institutions and cultural stakeholders to ensure equitable access to resources and experiences that celebrate the county's diverse cultures and art makers, which makes her an excellent guest host for our program tonight. And our other special guest host is Kasia Samel. Kasia, as you just saw in the video, has been the American Indian Resource Center librarian for LA County Library since 2018. Her work involves developing and maintaining the center's collection, assisting with research, and serving and outreaching to the American Indian, Alaska Native communities, as well as the general public regarding American Indian and Alaska Native topics and issues. Tonight, Isabel and Kasia will be interviewing Dina Gilio-Whitaker. Dina is a member of the Colville Confederated Tribes, and she's a lecturer of American Indian Studies at California State University, San Marcos, and an independent consultant and educator in environmental justice policy planning. At CSUSM, she teaches courses on environmentalism and American Indians, traditional ecological knowledge, religion and philosophy, Native women's activism, American Indians in sports, and decolonization. She also works within the field of critical sports studies, examining the intersections of indigeneity and the sport of surfing. As a public intellectual, Dina brings her scholarship into focus as an award-winning journalist as well, contributing to numerous online outlets, including Indian Country Today, the Los Angeles Times, High Country News, and many more. Dina is the co-author with Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz of Beacon Press's All the Real Indians Died Off and 20 Other Myths About Native Americans, and her most recent book, As Long as Grass Grows, The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock, and that was released in 2019. Kasia, I am going to hand this program over to you for our land acknowledgement.
Thank you. And welcome, everybody. I hope you're having a wonderful evening and a wonderful Native American Heritage Month. I'm honored to be talking to Dina and Isabel. And before we start, we're going to go ahead and do our land acknowledgement. The County of Los Angeles recognizes that we occupy land originally and still inhabited and cared for by the Tongva, Tataviam, Serrano, Kizh, and Chumash peoples. We honor and pay respect to their elders and descendants, past, present, and emerging, as they continue their stewardship of these lands and waters. We acknowledge that settler colonization resulted in land seizure, disease, subjugation, slavery, relocation, broken promises, genocide, and multi-generational trauma. This acknowledgement demonstrates our responsibility and commitment to truth, healing, and reconciliation, and to elevating the stories, culture, and community of the original inhabitants of Los Angeles County. We are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these ancestral lands. We are dedicated to growing and sustaining relationships with Native peoples and local tribal governments, including, in no particular order, the Fernandino Tatavian Band of Mission Indians, the Gabrielino Tongva Indians of California Tribal Council, the Gabrielino Tongva San Gabriel Band of Mission Indians, the Gabrielino Band of Mission Indians Kitch Nation, the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, and the San Fernando Band of Mission Indians. Isabel and I are super excited to be talking to Tina and delving into this interview. So we're going to go get started with the first question.
Yeah, thank you all for being here. And as Kasha said, super excited to get to talk with my colleague and Dina as well. Dina, I wanted to sort of kick off our conversation by asking you about your book, All the Real Indians Died Off, and 20 Other Myths About Native Americans. This book, as you can tell by the title, discusses and explores a lot of common misconceptions about Native peoples. And, looking through some of the myths that you cite in this book, so many of them, not all of them, are about the history of Native Americans and tell a certain story about the past and what happened in the past. And, for any of us who haven't read the whole book yet, can you help us understand how these historical inaccuracies impact the lives and the experiences of Native Americans who are living today?
Okay, well, first I'll introduce myself by saying why Haskalao isquist Dina Gilio-Whitaker Uth isin kailusquist Silwa itk. And I just introduced myself in my tribal language, which is in Sukchin. It's the language of the Interior Salish people. I'm a Sinaixt and Okanagan descendant of the Colville Confederated Tribes in Washington State, which is in the upper Columbia River Plateau. But I come to you right now from the homelands of the Ahashman people in Orange County. So I'm close by. And that's where I live, and I work in the homelands of the Luceño Payamquisham people in San Marcos, at Cal State San Marcos. So to answer your question, the way the book is constructed is about, really uncovering what we call some of the master narratives of the United States, of how the stories that we tell in this country about the country's origins, which are wrapped up in very sanctimonious narratives that highlight that, this what we call American exceptionalism, the stories of America being so exceptional for its democracy and freedom and liberty and justice for all and all of that, while it covers over these very profound violent histories of slavery and colonialism. So when we talk about colonialism, what we're saying is, this history of very violent imperial invasion, the centuries of incursions of European settlement onto the continent, and the imposition of treaties that were always violated. The fantasy on the one hand of this very rosy picture of American history, happy settlers and happy pilgrims and all of that, versus these very violent genocidal practices. And so, and it's really only until very recently we're not even allowed to say the word genocide. Like it's been in our historiography so taboo to use that word that any historian writing about it from that perspective would be ostracized and not taken seriously. But it's really only in the last 15 to 20 years that it's become more acceptable, and now it's really it's pretty widely used. So understanding the context of that history then allows us to understand how Native people have been dehumanized, have been demonized, have been otherized, have been constructed as inferior others that were savage and primitive and in need of Christian improvement, to then justify these very violent histories that really paint this picture of genocide. So that's really the starting place for all of that. And from there, we can understand like how we get the mythologies and misconceptions and lies that have been told about Native people for centuries.
Something that comes up for me a lot when I think about this is the harm that can continue to be done when these myths and these lies go unchecked or uncorrected. Can you say, speak in your own words about like how telling history from the point of view of Native Americans and Native peoples and Indigenous Americans, like how that, pushes back against that sort of ongoing genocide in some ways, or ongoing dehumanization?
Yeah, it's a different perspective. So when you center settler histories, it erases all of that violence and all of those injustices to uphold these exceptionalist narratives. When Native people are given voice to their own experiences, the story really changes. And it's not always welcome. And that's really, what we've seen over the years. And we still get pushback when we talk about your mythologies, all the stories that you use to justify all that violence, to uphold the fantasy version of history, that, like, for example, one of those that come to mind is, well, and I still hear this one a lot, is that, well, Indians were, they were so violent and they were already killing each other when the Europeans got here. So this is somehow excuses the violence that was visited on Native peoples. Well, for one thing, that turns out really not to be true in the way that it's often put forward. And that's one of the myths in the book that we identify. And it's just, the actual reality of it. And this comes from military history studies, and especially by one historian in particular named John Grenier, who looked at it in his book called The First Way of War. Native people, and we have these from our own perspective. When the Europeans came, they were used to fighting wars that for millennia in Europe, that were with standing armies, with that were incredibly brutal and vicious. And so they had techniques of warfare that were full-scale domination and the wiping out of entire peoples. Well, that really wasn't the case here on this continent. There is no evidence for that. Could conflicts get violent and deadly? Oh, absolutely. But Native people were shocked when the Europeans came here with the kind of violence that they visited here. Native people were like caught off guard, like they had not encountered the kind of vicious warfare that the Europeans visited. So we can say that, but talking about that to this day, I mean, it's common to hear people push back against that and want to hold on to the story about, well, Indians were violent savages that were killing each other anyway.
Yeah, that brings me to my next question, which was like, out of you have 21 myths, I think, in the or 20 myths in the book, including the title, I guess. And is there one that you find like especially entrenched, or like that seems, more like, I don't know if that's a perfect like ranking them, but is there one that's really hard to like get through, get people to let go of?
Yes. Oh, there's a bunch of them, but what comes to mind right away is the title of the book, All the Real Indians Died Off and 20 Other Myths, is really speaking to this idea that many people in this country still have. Oh, there are still Indians. We thought they all died off. Literally, I mean, it's not uncommon to hear people say that because, the Native American population is very small still. And so it's not uncommon for people to never have met somebody who is of Native American heritage, or at least legitimate Native American heritage. Now, that's a whole other conversation, but tied up with this idea of, real Indian, what's a real Indian? Who is a real Indian? And, one of the pieces of that to unpack is like how we define that, how we understand who a real Native American is. And I would say that my thinking, continually evolving about that, especially with this new book that I have coming out next year, which we'll talk about later, but it's has to do with understanding Native American people as a racial group. And this turns out to be really, really entrenched, really hard to cast aside because we have, as people who are nations of people, of collectivities of people that Europeans encountered. We were tribes that were self-governing, self-determining, very organized, very sophisticated social systems, for the most part, who got constructed as, primitive savages, but then in time became racialized and therefore diminishing our existence as political groups. And so this racial thinking has gets distilled and boiled down to this idea of blood, that being a Native American person is like, based on fractions of blood quantums. And it's only Native people that we talk about this idea of, how much Indian blood do you have? Like that's a very common question for Native people to be asked. It's a very rude question. I would say right from the outset, don't ever ask somebody that. It's nobody else's business because, well, for all kinds of things, but it perpetuates this idea that being Native is somehow equivalent to some racial category, when really what it is a relationship to a tribal community, to a nation, to a community. And that's really how we understand it. And tribes as nations with a political relationship to the United States then makes who Native people are, as a political category. And that is something that nobody else has in this country. Only American Indian people have a political relationship to the United States. That's a really hard thing to explain to people, to say that, being Native American is not really it's not a, a race, even though we've all been conditioned to think that. It's really more about this political status.
Thank you, Dina. So I have to like piggyback on what you were saying, how a lot of people still ask, are they still native? And um, them coming to my center, that's one of the questions too. That they're not aware of how many indigenous peoples are in just LA County alone. And, we have one of the biggest urban populations, and it always like surprises me that a lot of people don't know. And if you guys are curious about like California Native history, it's definitely something that I would invite for you to take a look at. And Dina talks about that in her other book, As Long as Grass Grows. She does mention about California natives. So I highly, highly recommend that you put in a request if you haven't. But yeah, I totally see that in my work today. People just not realizing that there are still Native peoples all over the U.S. and around the world, Indigenous peoples that unfortunately, is being suppressed, or like their views and their voices are being suppressed for a variety of reasons. But going back to your As Long as Grass Grows book, in there you state that you wanted to highlight the importance of building alliances across different social and racial divides, and that you want institutions to use your book. And I just wanted to know more about like, or would like for you to discuss the motivation that you had in writing the book, and as well as the importance of the collaboration between Indigenous groups and non-Indigenous groups for climate change.
The way that that book came about was that I was asked to write it. And the reason was because it began as a master's thesis project from grad school. I had done a study about a thing that happened here in Southern California some years ago with the defeat of a proposed toll road that was going to be built in Orange County, right in the town where I live now in San Clemente. This was a story that began in about 1997, and it was a fight uh, waged by first environmentalists and then surfers and then the Native American community to stop this proposed toll road that was going to come through a watershed, a pristine watershed, and connect up to Highway 5 down in near what's called Trestles, a surf break. It's a world-class surf break. And so the people were up in arms because the building of this 6-lane toll road would have severely disrupted this pristine watershed and disrupted uh, some endangered species in the region and probably ruined the wave quality of trestles. And so, and at the same time, it would have desecrated a Native American sacred site. It would have gone through this place called San Mateo Creek Campground, which is in a state park on a military reservations, Camp Pendleton. So it was a very interesting tangle of jurisdictions, of complications, and against all odds, what I wanted to study was how this Native American sacred site was protected against all the odds. And that was the focus of the study. Like, how did all of this happen against all the odds? And what I discovered was it was really because of the power of coalition building and working in community, these communities with very diverse, different interests. It was the coming together of these communities that worked to stop a private company from accomplishing its goals. So it was an underdog story of success, but it built on other stories where we've seen these kinds of alliances across diverse, sometimes counterintuitive communities that where there have been successes, especially, around environmental interests, protecting ecosystems and other kinds of environmental habitats. So it's something that's growing, and it's going to continue to grow, especially as climate change ramps up and our, ongoing attacks to the environment, depending on the sway of our political environments, it's going to continue and intensify. So anyway, that was what the study started out as. So the book idea came about during 2016 during the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. So for those of you who don't know or don't remember that time in 2016, the Standing Rock Sioux tribe was threatened by an oil pipeline that had been rerouted away from a white city called Bismarck in North Dakota. It was rerouted to within a half a mile of a reservation community because of perceived threats to the drinking water. So this white community in Bismarck didn't want an oil pipeline threatening their water source, but they were okay with it threatening the water source of a tribal community. That made it an environmental justice issue. And so it was a huge flashpoint. It became an international issue that year and led to this protest camp that lasted for 9 months, for most of the year of 2016. And so I went to the protest to cover it as a journalist. And it was during that time that my publishers at Beacon, said, well, they knew that I had done my graduate research on this environmental justice issue, and said, would I be willing to write a book about this? And I said, absolutely, of course. And I mean, so that's how that came about. And so, I was really grateful for that. And it turned out to be just a really important moment in time. And the book then took on a life of its own.
Thank you for that. So one of the things that I was really, I think, impressed and just like surprised about learning and from reading your book was just how many other, um, ethnic groups were already working towards environmental justice actions and like protecting their community. And you mentioned the Congressional Black Caucus, and then you mentioned like Cesar Chavez and other examples. And what really is like the main part of your book. You're saying that, or you're implying that all of this injustice is like part of settler colonization, and I never really connected that, and that was just like mind blowing for me to hear that. And when you think about it, I have to agree. And you're I don't know, it's just like it really resonated with me, and I wanted to point it out for the audience. And if you can elaborate on that, like how a lot of our Black and Brown communities are being affected by this settler colonization and how environmental justice is really tied to that.
Yeah, so really the main point that I'm making in the book is that environmental justice for American Indian people is different than it is for other communities. So if we understand environmental injustice as the disproportionate exposure to risk and harm to environmental processes, like, with the siting of toxic facilities, waste dumps, factories, like things like that, that expose ethnic minority communities, because that's what happens especially in urban, and not always urban environments. Sometimes it's rural environments too, where, like Black communities, or, Black and Brown communities are built in their, these very politically disempowered communities. You'll get a disproportionate building of these kinds of facilities, and that raises their health issues, and poisons the waters and the lands, and the air and all of that. We call that environmental racism. And it's a real thing. It turns out, studies have shown, for years, that's demonstrable. For Native American people, it's different, though, because it's much bigger, it's much older, it's connected to these histories of being invaded, of genocide, of being forcibly moved off lands, and being, having their ability to feed themselves removed, things like that. So my argument is that we can't separate those things for Native people. It's beyond environmental racism. It's really about how colonialism has always targeted Native people, their very existence, and still does. Because if we understand settler colonialism not just as something that happens in time, like at a certain point in history, but as a system that's constantly ongoing, then the threat is never gone. For Native people, it's always already there. It's just a different kind of framework. We have to understand, again, like decentering race as our analysis, and centering the political existence of Native people as nations and tribes.
Thank you for that. And just as a follow-up question, you had mentioned in your book that you wanted institutions to use your book And I wanted to ask, in what ways did you want institutions to use it? And do you think, if you've met that goal of, or do you think that the way that institutions are using it is how you wanted to use it? If that makes sense.
Well, from what I've seen, it's been what I know is that the book is widely taught in colleges and universities, and I think probably to a lesser extent in high schools. I know that it's being used a lot, and that makes me really happy. People have found it really valuable, and I've seen it referenced in policy documents at the government level too. I there was the Biden administration issued a policy statement a couple of years ago talking about, the importance of indigenous knowledge being integrated into all levels of the federal government land management policies. And I was pleased to see there was a reference to my book in that report. So um, that's why we do, this kind of work. We hope that our work will have impact at the most, in the most important places, and that was one of them. So, and I know that it's been used in all kinds of places, even, internationally in other countries. So,
Thank you, Dina.
I had a question that I wanted to ask you. I think that Kasha and I were both once youth librarians and youth services librarians. So I always like to ask a question about like what kind of, insight do you like to share with young people? And I especially wanted to ask about, you've written in your books about you're a member of the Colville Confederated Tribes, and as I understand, those traditional lands comprise much of the Pacific Northwest. But you, as you said, you grew up in Southern California and away from that place. And do you have any, what was that experience like? And do you have any insight from that experience that you can share with young people who might also feel disconnected from their cultural lands?
yeah, I often say that I'm the first generation off the reservation in
Mhm.
my family, meaning that I'm the first generation to be born and raised not close to the community. And that was during a period of time that we refer to in federal Indian policy as termination. So I was born in the 50s, and during that time period, the federal government was actively trying to end the existence of tribes, and which it's done. And that's, of course, it's one of the genocidal policies of the United States. And the way it was doing it at that time was to disestablish reservations. And one of the ways that they did that was to encourage people to leave the reservations and moving into, cities. My mom and her mom, so that's how I inherit my heritage, is through my mother's line. They had this program called relocation, and it was a jobs program for reservation Indians. My mom didn't come on a relocation voucher, but she came during that period to California when this migration was happening, and people did it for a lot of reasons. The reservation, environment all was always pretty awful. They were, Indians have always been the most poverty-stricken people of all groups in this country, and reservations are places of intense poverty. And so, leaving the reservations was a matter of survival, and wanting, to improve their lives in economic ways. And so this period of time during the 1960s results in this demographic shift in this country, where prior to that, the majority of Native American people were still living in their reservation communities. After those termination and relocation years, this demographic shift happens where most Native people are not living, born and raised and living in their tribal communities. And so this leads to, so this disconnection is really, it contributes to what we call trauma, like intergenerational trauma for Native people of, not only surviving genocide, but, now not having access to your culture. So then, what does it mean to be like, in my case, what does it mean to be Colville, not living in my tribal community, not speaking my language, not having access to my tribal traditions? Then it becomes a process of reconnecting. Like, how do you do that, especially if you're really far away from your community? And so for me, it's been a lifelong journey. The longer that Native people are disconnected from their communities, the harder it becomes to reconnect, and the more distant you become from your family. And so it's really often very difficult to do that. But for me, it's been this lifelong project to stay connected to family on the reservation, to community. And so I do that in very deliberate ways, and to reclaim those relationships and reclaim my language. And at this point, I'm fortunate. Thank God we have the internet, because the technology gives us new tools, and I can learn my tribal language not living in the community. It's not ideal, but it's still a way to rejuvenate, to reclaim it. So it's challenging. And for other folks, I mean, we have now generations of people who are experiencing the same kinds of reality. But I would say to those younger people to do whatever it takes. You stay in contact. Being a tribal person, being American Indian, is about community. It's about maintaining that kinship. Without that kinship, it's a different story. Sometimes we say it's not, being Native is not about what you claim, it's about who claims you. That's not always true. But there still has to be a community involved. So, there's another conversation to be had here about, self-claiming, what it means to say you're Native American based on a family rumor or something like that. And that's something that we have to have that conversation too. But yeah, so just stay in touch with do what you can to maintain your relationship with your tribal relations and reservation communities, and keep it going. It's hard, but it's doable if you really have that kinship.
It's always great to talk to your family. You never know what type of stories you hear and who they could connect you with. And sometimes you just need to give them a chance, right? And hopefully we have that opportunity to talk to our elders. Did you want to add anything, Isabel, before I go into our
I
next
just think
question?
that was a lovely answer. I mean, I like what you said about community, and I think that that has a lot of, applicability for a lot of people who feel, maybe disconnected from any sense of belonging, and that can be very prevalent in this modern era.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I think
it's
that that's
really
a wonderful
true.
answer.
That's really true, even for settler people who are not Native. There's a book, the scholar named Pauline Boss, who wrote a book some years ago. It's been at least 20 years ago. She wrote a book called Ambiguous Loss, and she's a sociologist that studies what's called unresolved grief. And she studied like over 4,000 families, and to understand like how, what happens to families that have left like their old countries, like European countries, to come here. She maintains that they exhibit some of this trauma, some through this unresolved grief of the loss of culture. So giving up who you are, your culture to come to a new place. We have all these, rosy romantic stories of that in this country, but there's this, sort of unspoken dark side to that that speaks to trauma that doesn't get resolved. And I think there's room for a lot more research here, but when you have that kind of unresolved trauma and grief, it can lead to abuse of other people. And I think that's one of the things that helps explain the violent history of this country against Native people. So
Oh, gosh, yes, that's very strong. Mhm.
yeah, yeah, that's
Yeah,
getting pretty deep. But I think any grad students out there, or undergrads, you want to pursue a line of inquiry, I think that's a very worthwhile one.
I was about to pop in the link for the book that you mentioned, but I'll do that a little bit later. My last question is, well, a colleague shared that she read your book and she felt very angry at the systems that strip Native peoples of their autonomy and self-governance. And I know in an interview you mentioned like a few years ago that you did with, I believe it was like Native American Families and Services. You mentioned that when you were younger, you were on a journey of self-discovery and you found out a lot about your family history and other Native issues, and you felt lied to, and you became extremely angry. Can you elaborate on what you did with your anger and how your readers and the viewers here today can productively channel their anger?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been such a, like I said, a lifelong journey for me. I always knew where I came from. I always knew, what my tribal background was. I always knew my mom was an Indian. And, we had maintained our connections to our family on the reservation from when I was a little kid. And, but it, just grew distant with time. And so I went back there as an adult to reestablish those connections. I knew that I grew up with a lot of dysfunction. There was alcoholism in my family that was really obvious. What I now know about it is what we call trauma, this term intergenerational trauma. Like this has really evolved over time as we come to understand it. But I didn't understand why. I didn't understand why there was so much alcoholism and so much of this dysfunction. And so going back to the reservation to reconnect with my family there was, I came with these questions, and I remember in 19 so this is like 1991, and I went to go visit an uncle, and he was my great uncle, my mom's uncle, and he was 75 years old at the time, and I spent time with him, and he told me all kinds of stories that I had did not know. And he told me the story about being in boarding school, and him and his brother and his sister, which is my grandmother, had all been sent to Chemawa, this native boarding school in Oregon. It was the first time I had ever heard this. I was not we didn't have this story passed, like, my mom didn't talk about this, or maybe she mentioned it, I remember the word, but I didn't know, like, what the history was. He told me what I now know is a textbook boarding school story, a story of abuse, of, corporal punishment, of being there for years and years, and, all the ways that they were, had this just horrible, horrible abuse on them, and the needing to run away and to go home, and not being able to. And I was horrified by that, and it changed my life. I mean, I was outraged by it, and, and I it was that's when I really began to realize that I had been lied to my whole life. All of the conditioning of my education, of school, and the American exceptionalist narratives, and, how lovely America is, and the democracy and all that, to me was all lies. And I vowed for the rest of my life to educate myself and to educate other people about what I was learning. And to keep in mind at this time in 1991, these boarding school history stories were not well known. They were often, hidden in families because they produced so much trauma and shame, and the need to move on and forget about it. But at the same time, it causes all this illness, this psychological illness in people. And but it all made sense. And as the years went on, uh, the scholarship started to come out about it. It became more and more known. And now, where we're at now, of course, it's become much more widely known. But at the time, it was not. And it's ultimately why I ended up becoming an educator, going back to school and getting a degree in Native American Studies, and then graduate school. And now, I teach people about all of this stuff. And that's really how manage my rage about it. I now understand that I carry this trauma in my body. If we understand intergenerational as epigenetic trauma, like that which you carry in your genetic structure, like you're born with it. I came to realize it at a point in my life that I mean, had been in therapy for years, like trying to work out my issues, and came to realize that it was never gonna go away. Like, the anger, that I had inside me was never there was no end to it, and so the only other option was to manage it, and to channel it in a productive way. So learning some skills, some interpersonal psychological, skills, learning well-being and wellness. And for me, that's why I do what I do. It really helps me manage my trauma and my anger about all this. And it's something that's really, really common. Everybody I know that has a similar experience, really, this is their story. Mine is just one version of that story.
Yeah, well, I have to say that your way of managing your anger is just very giving. And I know in like another interview, you had stressed that what you wanted to do in your work is to benefit the Native community. And I have to say that like your work is amazing, and I think that your goal has is being met, or that you're actually doing what you say you want to do. So that's amazing, and like congratulations to that. And I hope you still use that energy to do your work.
Well, I mean, at this point, it's like it's almost not even a choice anymore. It's just what I have to do, for my own well-being. Yeah, there really isn't another option for me. I've always felt like I was born into a war that never ended. We talk about the Indian Wars in this country, and for Native people, we know that they never ended. The attacks on our communities and who we are is they're ongoing, from physical violence, from the problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women and people. Like on a physical level, that's still happening. And then on another level, the violence happens in our social systems, in our legal system. The impulse to eliminate Native people's political existence is ongoing. And so we have to be vigilant. We can never relax. We can never rest, um, because it's nonstop. So, um, yeah.
Thank you. I know we're running short on time, but this conversation has been super, I think, inspiring and enjoyable, and just like I think amazing just to hear your knowledge and the work that you're doing. I'm not sure if Isabel has something to say, or if Christina has some questions from the audience. Again, I apologize for taking up a bulk of her time, guys, but I think these were really meaningful questions and answers.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in with a question from our Q&A, as I too am a former youth services librarian. So, um, first off, this guest says, "Thank you for being here, Dina." And then she asks, "What are the most important and valuable ways that you would recommend individuals uplift, support, and build solidarity with Indigenous folks, both as fellow SoCal community members and also as the parents of young children?"
Mm-hmm. Find out what's going on in your community. With Native issues, find where the needs are. And to me, so the call to action is really always about, it always begins with education, educate yourself about these histories, read, there's lots of good books out there anymore and podcasts and lots to know. Just reshape your knowledge about, re-educate yourself because we've all been miseducated. And that's the starting place. And then find out where the needs are, and in urban environments it's always trickier, I would say. There are competing groups. Sometimes it's hard to know what are the best groups to align yourself with, but it takes time. So just find out what's going on. It's in some place like Southern California, a lot of the activism is around, protecting like coastal environments, for example, protecting access to sacred sites. Sometimes, it's about tribal efforts to get land back and protecting language reacquisition. So there's not really a simple answer to that question. I would just say, continue to educate yourself and just keep your eyes open.
Just looking through all the wonderful comments from everyone in the chat, it seems like people have been very moved and are very grateful for this conversation. I mean, I think one question that comes up a little, if you have a couple more minutes, it seems like a question that's coming up here as well is like, moving away from, I thought, and this was very new and interesting to me as well, of like moving away from an idea of Native American as a race or as a racial group to a political group. Some people have been asking about like, how then do you find your heritage sometimes if it's not necessarily through like if you can't sort of follow a genetic lineage or something like that. I think that's sort of interesting to
Or
consider.
it's
I don't know
it's
if you have any thoughts.
genealogical, right? So that's a better way of understanding it. And the
Hmm.
thing is, like, we have to accept a reality that in this country it's a phenomenon that people have family rumors, that there was an Indian in the family. And often it turns out really not to be true. Native people are some of the most well documented people in the history of this country. There are good reasons why some people didn't get documented. That definitely happens. But more often, it seems to be the case that people with this history of like a Cherokee great grandmother or Apache or whatever, usually it's Cherokee, turns out not to be true. And so, this phenomenon of self-identifying based on a family rumor has, it's it's harmful to Native communities because it does help perpetuate this idea of Native people as a racial group. So we need to move away from that and accept the reframing of this as, being Native is about connection, about this kinship connection to a community, and to a family, and so to a tribe. There's all kinds of tools out there anymore. I mean, the online ancestry groups, it's come a huge way. I mean, even the DNA test is not a good way. People are running to these DNA tests to see, what their genetic ancestry is. And we're seeing people, coming back with like 1% or 2% Native American DNA, and now all of a sudden they're Native American. Well, that doesn't make you Native American. A DNA test without any connection to a tribe or a community. That's like a racialized understanding of it. And it's just really not, it's not the case. At the same time, like if there are actual Native people in your genealogy, like do the research, like do the research, go to the roles. I noticed in the
Yeah,
opening
we have the
video,
hmm
that was really interesting that you had these roles, like
yeah.
some of the roles. It's like
So
that's a great resource
yes, so if you
for
have those
people.
type of questions, you can call the ARC. It is one of our common questions. And like Dina said, you have to talk, you have to do the genealogy work, you have to talk to your elders if you do have them, if you're lucky enough for them to remember, to be alive. You have to really trace your work, and it's a lot of work
Hmm.
to figure out how you're related to different tribal nations.
If you are,
Mhm, mhm.
right? Because you can do that work and have it not turn anything up. Well, if there's nothing there, then it's not there. Then it's
Yeah.
probably just a family rumor.
And you do need to know which tribal nation you're associated with. A lot of times people don't know, and there's no magical database that will, you plug in your name and it'll show which tribal nation you're associated with. That's not how it works. Um, but, I encourage you to talk to your elders, talk to your family friends, do um, some tracing, look at legal documents, look at any documents that you may have at home, or your grandmother or your grandfather, whoever you believe has a connection. Um, that's really important documentation just to prove, you know. But yeah, thank you for that. Was there like another question? I know we're going past the time, so um,
I'm seeing a question. We can talk a couple more minutes. And somebody's asking a question about my take on the Buffy Saint Marie situation. Yeah, so we're into the territory of what we call pretendianism. It's a very contentious but increasingly high profile issue in Indian country. And I will say that this is the subject of my next book. And that will be coming out next year, next fall. And so it's taking on this very difficult issue of Native identity and ethnic fraud and other what I call difficult conversations about nativeness, about being Native American. And yeah, I have a long, when you read the book, you'll see about, I tell the story about uh, a, relationship I had with Sasheen Littlefeather, who is known for being the woman that rejected the Oscar on behalf of Marlon Brando in 1973. She turned out to be a complete fraud. And that was really hard for people to hear when that came out 2 years ago, that knowledge. But I knew it before that. And so I use that as a case study to talk about this issue in the new book. And I, when the Buffy St. Marie thing happened, I was like, how sad for us. But the evidence was overwhelming. I mean, I looked at the documentary that, the investigative documentary that looked into her genealogy. And isn't it interesting that as soon as she gets called out, she retires and she's invisible. She has no kind of explanation. She's gone dark. And now, she's not accountable for it. And I think that was true. I think it was true that she was a fraud. And it's really awful for generations of people. But so, and think of all the children that she lied to on Sesame Street. Like, that's criminal. I mean, it's terrible. So like this has to stop. We have to stop just, perpetuating family rumors or just out and out lies. Um, it doesn't happen in other ethnic racial groups that people claim to, not like it does in Indian, claims to Native Americanness. Like, it's got to stop. So we have to have these really difficult conversations.
Well, I love that we got to touch on what your next book is about, because that was one of our questions that we hope to get to. And we'll everyone on this call will be placing a hold on it, no doubt, at the library when it comes out.
For sure. The ARC will have a few copies.
No doubt.
And
Tasha, any last thoughts?
I believe that was our last question, but I do want to thank Dina for sharing her knowledge, her research that she's been, um, you know, accruing this past years, decades since you've found out about your family history and just like your passion for environmental justice. And I hope you have a long, 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 long career so we can
Mhm.
actually see like the benefit of like your work and people that you inspire.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
thank you. It's been lovely and look forward to coming back.
Yes.
Having
Part
you back.
two,
Thank you
guys.
so much. Thank you
All
to everyone
right.
who joined us tonight as well.
Thank you for your time. I do want to point out that we do have other Native American programming at our other libraries. Please take a visit at our, or take a look or visit our website. And yes, this amazing conversation with Dina is recorded, so you can share with your classes, your friends, and those who will enjoy this conversation. And I believe Christina will be sending out the link, or you can visit our YouTube site. So thank you for being generous with your time, Dina, and our audience. Thank you, Isabel and Christina, and everyone who worked on this. And I hope you guys have a wonderful night and an awesome, awesome, awesome Native American Heritage Month. And yeah, have a nice
Thank
one,
Thank
guys.
you
you.
all.
Good night,
Have a good
everybody.
evening, everyone.